In the dead silence of a forgotten mountain fortress, where cold winds clawed at stone walls and shadows felt older than memory itself, a whisper once echoed that terrified kings, humbled empires, and rewrote the fate of entire civilizations. A whisper that spoke of the assassins, a brotherhood so enigmatic, so feared, and so ruthlessly precise that their very name would become synonymous with death delivered from the unseen. And this story, the real history of the assassins, begins not with a blade slipping between ribs or a hooded figure perched over a city, but with an idea so powerful that it outlived its founder, its enemies, and even the empire that tried to erase it from the earth. Imagine the world of the 11th century. Empires rising and fracturing, crusaders marching east with banners of faith, sultans battling for dominance. And in the middle of this storm stood a man whose mind was sharper than any dagger he ever commanded. Hassan-i Sabbah, the architect of a movement that would frighten the mightiest monarchs and spark legends that still burn through our imagination today. The assassins were real, but their true story is far stranger, more dramatic and more human than the myths woven around them. To understand them, we must travel deep into Persia, to the rugged Alborz mountains, to a place that seemed carved from fear and ambition alike, Alamut, the eagle's nest, a fortress so unreachable that even armies hesitated to look at its towering cliffs. There, Hassan built not just a stronghold but a world within a world, a sanctuary for rebels, scholars, dreamers, and warriors who believed in his cause, and a nightmare for anyone who dared oppose him. Yet the assassins were not merely killers. They were philosophers of death, strategists of psychological warfare, and masters of the art of patience. They did not need armies. They did not need vast fields of battle. They needed only a single devoted follower with a blade and a mission. Every king knew that even surrounded by guards, even atop a throne, even behind city walls, he could wake up with a dagger beside his bed and a message carved into the table. You are never safe. Kings signed treaties out of fear. Crusader generals altered strategies because of whispers. Sultans slept with one eye open. The assassins understood something that modern intelligence agencies would discover centuries later. Fear is the most effective weapon, and precision strikes can change the fate of nations. But their story is not simply one of terror. It is one of ideology, sacrifice, betrayal, passion, and survival in a world that saw them as both threat and miracle. Before the legend, before the terror, before the unstoppable myth, there was the young Hassan, a brilliant scholar from Qom, whose hunger for knowledge outgrew the limits of his birthplace. He traveled to the intellectual centers of the Islamic world, absorbing philosophy, mathematics, theology, and the radical teachings of the Ismailis, a sect whose ideas about leadership, spiritual authority, and truth challenged the foundations of the ruling Seljuk Empire. It was here Hassan found his purpose, not merely to question power but to build a new kind of power, one that existed not through armies but through loyalty, belief, and mastery of the human psyche. But revolutions never come without enemies, and the Seljuks saw the Ismailis as dangerous heretics, a threat that must be crushed. Hassan was forced to flee, moving from city to city, gathering followers one whisper at a time until he discovered Alamut, a fortress held by a minor lord who never imagined he was standing atop the future heartbeat of a revolution. Through cunning, negotiation, and strategy, Hassan gained control of Alamut without spilling a single drop of blood. That moment marked the birth of the Nizari assassin state. From here, Hassan began crafting a society unlike any other, a society that was disciplined, educated, and loyal to the death, where every follower believed not just in him but in the cause with a devotion that baffled and terrified outsiders. Their enemies would say the assassins used magic, drugs, and illusions. Their followers would say they used faith, purpose, and unshakable conviction. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between, tangled in politics, prejudice, legend, and fear. And as Hassan transformed Alamut into an impenetrable fortress of knowledge and strategy, the Seljuks began to tremble. Their vizier, Nizam al-Mulk, one of the most powerful men in the empire, became the first major target, and with his assassination, the world realized that the assassins were not a rumor. They were a force capable of striking at the heart of empires. What followed the death of Nizam al-Mulk sent tremors across the Seljuk world, because his assassination was not merely the removal of a statesman. It was a declaration, a signal flare fired into the night sky, announcing that a new power had risen, one that operated in silence with absolute loyalty and devastating precision. Overnight, the word assassin spread like fire through marketplaces, barracks, palaces, and caravans. Mothers hushed their children with the name. Soldiers whispered it around flickering campfires. Viziers felt phantom blades brushing their ribs. And kings, men who believed themselves untouchable, now understood that crowns could not stop death delivered by a hand hidden among their own servants. The assassins did not strike randomly. Each target was chosen because removing them shifted the balance of power. Their attacks were choreographed like theater. Killers stepped from crowds, from disguises, from silence itself, delivering death in broad daylight, in front of guards and soldiers, because the message mattered as much as the kill. We fear nothing. We are everywhere and we always reach our mark. But behind the terrifying spectacle was Hassan's meticulous mind. From his austere chamber atop Alamut, surrounded by scrolls, ink, maps, and reports sent by loyal spies across Persia and Syria, he governed not like a warlord, but like a scholar king. He demanded discipline. He demanded clarity of thought. He demanded absolute devotion. Even the stories of paradise gardens and intoxicating illusions, fantasies invented by enemies like Marco Polo, were tools of misinformation that Hassan allowed to circulate, because every rumor that painted the assassins as supernatural only increased their power. Reality didn't matter. Perception ruled, and Hassan understood perception better than any man of his age. Yet the assassins were not simply an organization of killers. Within Alamut's stone walls, young recruits studied philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and theology. They learned languages, strategy, and stealth. They trained their minds long before their hands ever touched a blade. To be an assassin was not to die for a cause. It was to live with purpose so powerful that death became a footnote. And in this crucible of knowledge and faith, Hassan forged men and women who saw themselves not as soldiers, but as instruments of justice against tyrants. But power invites enemies, and soon the Seljuks launched massive campaigns to destroy Alamut once and for all. Armies marched through narrow valleys, scaling cliffs with siege towers, bombarding the fortress with catapults. Yet Alamut stood. Its walls carved from the mountain itself seemed immune to fire and steel. Even when invaders drew near, they found themselves facing defenders who were not simply soldiers, but believers willing to fight with an intensity that terrified seasoned warriors. Siege after siege collapsed, and with every failed attempt the legend of the Eagle's Nest grew, a phantom keep that no empire could conquer. Meanwhile, Hassan's influence spread west into Syria, where charismatic leaders like Rashid ad-Din Sinan, later known as the Old Man of the Mountain, expanded the network of assassins. Sinan became a mythic figure in his own right, famed for acts of psychological warfare that still echo through history, such as the night he ordered his followers to stand silently on mountain ledges, arms open, motionless under the moon, demonstrating that discipline born of belief was stronger than fear of death. Crusaders who witnessed such displays wrote home in trembling disbelief. These men, they said, were not human. They were shadows with beating hearts. And as Crusader states, Seljuk princes and rival Muslim factions clashed across the Middle East. The assassins maneuvered between them like master chess players, removing pieces from the board with surgical precision. They assassinated both Muslim and Christian leaders, depending on who posed the greatest threat to their survival. Count Raymond the of Tripoli fell beneath their blades. Conrad of Montferrat, king-elect of Jerusalem, was struck down in the streets of Tyre. And yet at times they also formed alliances with Crusader kings when it served their interests. Diplomacy flowed alongside daggers. Deals were made in shadows. The assassins were not bound by religious lines, they were bound only by strategy. But even as their influence grew, so did the hatred of those who failed to crush them. Chroniclers who could not defeat them with armies instead waged war with ink, spreading stories of hash-induced trances, enchanted gardens, and manipulative rituals. They painted the assassins as soulless fanatics under the spell of a demonic master. And though these stories were lies, the assassins allowed them to live, because the myth was their greatest weapon. Meanwhile, Hassan himself grew older. retreating deeper into asceticism, living a life of pure discipline. When one of his own sons violated the law of Alamut, Hassan ordered his execution, proving loyalty to principle mattered more than blood. When he finally died in 1124 after ruling Alamut for 34 years, he left behind a state feared by kings, respected by scholars, and shrouded forever in mystery. But the assassins did not die with him. They evolved, they adapted, they survived. After Hassan's death, leadership passed to his successors, men who carried his vision through some of the most turbulent decades the Middle East would ever witness. The world they inherited was shifting violently. Crusader kingdoms rose and collapsed, Seljuk dynasties fractured into feuding principalities, and new powers emerged from distant horizons. Amid this chaos, the assassins refined their strategies, understanding that survival required not merely the blade but the art of adaptation. Their network expanded across mountain fortresses scattered through Persia and Syria, each one a mirror of Alamut. Self-sufficient, heavily fortified, strategically placed, and inhabited by loyal devotees. From these bastions, the assassins projected influence far beyond their numbers. They were few, but their reach was immense because fear magnified their presence. A single assassin infiltrating a palace could have more impact than 1,000 soldiers clashing on a battlefield. And so their legacy grew, village by village, court by court, rumor by rumor, until the very mention of their name stirred unease across 3 continents. Yet the assassins were never mindless killers. They were selective, deliberate, and deeply political. During the reign of the second Grand Master, Kia Buzurg Umid, the Nizari state stabilized, shifting from mere survival to structured governance. Under his control, the assassins maintained peaceful coexistence with many local rulers, proving that diplomacy, backed by the threat of surgical violence, could maintain balance more effectively than war. This period saw the refinement of the fidai, the elite operatives whose missions shaped history. These young men, trained for years in stealth and discipline, functioned as living instruments of statecraft. They wore no armor, they carried no shields. They relied only on their wits, their courage, and their unbreakable loyalty. When sent on a mission, they understood they might not return. Yet they did not fear death, because in their minds, death in service to the cause was not an end but a fulfillment of purpose. Their training was rigorous, combining physical endurance, keen observation, psychological resilience, and mastery of disguise. Some infiltrated enemy courts pretending to be servants, scribes, scholars, or merchants, spending months, sometimes years, gaining trust, waiting for the perfect moment. In this patience lay their power. They did not kill impulsively. They killed when the future depended on it. But history is not shaped solely by ideology. It is also shaped by personalities. And none were more dramatic than the figure who emerged decades after Hassan. Rashid ad-Din Sinan, the Syrian leader whose myth would spread all the way to Europe, transforming him into the legendary Old Man of the Mountain. Sinan was a master of psychological warfare, a strategist who understood that the mind was the true battlefield. Under his leadership, the Syrian branch of the assassins reached unprecedented influence. No blood was drawn, no guards were alerted. Yet the message was unmistakable. We can reach you whenever we choose. Fear, not steel, was the currency of the assassins, and Sinan spent it with brilliance. One of the most symbolic moments under Sinan's leadership came during negotiations with Saladin, the mighty Ayyubid Sultan, whose armies were sweeping through Syria. But Sinan refused to bow. During one negotiation, Saladin witnessed 2 of Sinan's followers stand on the edge of a towering cliff. With a simple gesture from Sinan, the men hurled themselves into the abyss without hesitation. From that moment, Saladin reconsidered the cost of war against them. Instead of annihilation, he sought coexistence. Yet the world outside the Middle East saw the assassins through darker, more distorted lenses. European chroniclers, confused and frightened by their precision, invented fantastical tales to explain their courage. They believed the assassins were drugged, entranced by illusions of paradise, compelled by promises of heavenly reward. These myths were born from misunderstanding, shaped by fear, and passed down through travelers like Marco Polo centuries later. Polo claimed to have visited the remnants of Alamut and described gardens of intoxicating luxury, guarded by maidens and fountains of wine, a hallucination-inducing training ground for loyal killers. Nothing could have been further from the truth, but the myth endured, carving the word assassin into the Western imagination as a symbol of mystical murderers enslaved by narcotic visions. The real assassins were far more extraordinary, not because they were manipulated, but because they acted from conviction. Their discipline was born of belief, not illusion. They were not puppets. They were thinkers, warriors, spies, diplomats, and martyrs. Their strength came from unity, not drugs. Yet even the strongest foundations can crumble when faced with overwhelming force, and looming on the horizon a storm approached that would sweep across the world like a plague. The Mongol Empire, led by men whose brutality would eclipse anything the assassins had ever known. But nothing in human memory compared to the fury that thundered out of the Asian steppes in the 13th century, a force that toppled empires as casually as a hammer shatters glass. Led first by Genghis Khan and later by his relentless descendants, the Mongols brought a new kind of war, one defined not by honor or negotiation but by total annihilation. Cities that resisted were erased, populations were slaughtered, libraries, monuments, and entire cultures burned beneath their hooves. Against such a tidal wave, even the assassins' unmatched strategy and mountain fortresses seemed fragile. Their downfall began with a single moment: the assassination of a Mongol general named Chagatai, believed to be orchestrated by the assassins. Whether the accusation was true or fabricated mattered little. The Mongols desired no justification for destruction. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis and commander of the Mongol armies in the Middle East, received direct orders from his brother, the great Khan Munka, to wipe the assassins from the face of the earth. This was not a war, it was a sentence. Hulagu marched west with one of the largest armies the region had ever seen, a force engineered to break cities far stronger than any mountaintop citadel. In his path lay the heart of the Nizari state, Alamut. Before reaching it, Hulagu swept aside smaller assassin fortresses like a blade cutting through tall grass. But none could stop the Mongol machine. When Alamut finally came into view, it was as if myth and reality collided. The fortress, perched impossibly atop its rocky peak, had defied armies for generations. Seljuk sultans, Persian princes, and crusader commanders had hurled themselves against it and broken like waves on stone. But the Mongols were not like other armies. They came with siege engineers from China, catapults capable of hurling boulders the size of oxen, and explosives that lit the sky in roaring fire. The siege of Alamut became a clash between two symbols: the unstoppable Mongol war engine and the legendary fortress that had embodied Nizari resilience for more than a century. Inside Alamut, panic did not reign, discipline did. The assassins prepared for siege as they had many times before. Archers lined the walls, granaries were stocked. Defenders sharpened blades and recited prayers. Yet even they sensed the shift in the winds of fate. When Mongol catapults launched their first barrage, the mountains trembled. Walls cracked, fire rained from the heavens. Days stretched into weeks as the fortress endured punishment few structures on earth could withstand. But stone can only resist for so long, and when the Mongols finally breached Alamut's defenses, the defenders fought with the fury of men who knew the world they built was being torn apart. Scholars burned books to keep them from enemy hands. Fighters hurled themselves into hopeless battles. Some sought martyrdom, others hid sacred texts in caverns and tunnels, hoping that fragments of their legacy might survive even if their bodies did not. In December 1256, Alamut fell. The eagle's nest was no more. Its archives, like a treasure of philosophy, science, theology, and Nizari literature, were dragged out and set ablaze by Hulagu's men. For days, the smoke of knowledge lost forever rose into the sky, and with it an era ended. Yet even as the fortress crumbled, the assassin spirit refused to die. Survivors fled into remote mountains and deserts, scattering like embers carried by the wind. Though the Mongols wiped out most of their strongholds in Persia, the Syrian branch endured. Under Mongol occupation, Mamluk domination, and centuries of shifting rulers, they adapted, evolving in secrecy. Their knives no longer struck kings in public squares. Their missions became quieter, more political, more intertwined with diplomacy. In time, the Nizari Ismailis transformed from a militant order into a community of scholars, traders, and spiritual leaders. Their legacy continued through the line of imams who guided the faithful into a new era. The modern Ismaili community, millions strong today, owes its survival to this transformation, a shift from the blade to the mind, from mountain fortresses to intellectual resilience. But history remembers the assassins not for their peaceful evolution, but for the centuries during which they shaped destinies with silence and steel. Their legend lived on in every palace rumor, every frightened king, every Western tale that twisted truth into myth. Their name became a word that transcended culture and language, a word that exists today in nearly every dictionary on earth, though few remember where it truly came from. And so long after Alamut fell, long after Mongol hooves turned its stone paths to dust, the story of the assassins refused to fade. Even in ruins, the memory of the brotherhood lingered in the mountains, in the whispered tales of travelers who swore they saw shadows moving along cliffs long after the order had vanished. Their ghosts lived on in books, legends, and centuries of fascination. And as the centuries rolled forward, the world would rediscover the assassins not through ruins or chronicles, but through imagination, through novels, films, games, and stories that revived the myth in new forms, carrying echoes of the past into the modern age. Yet the story of the assassins does not end with ruins, smoke, or the fall of Alamut. In many ways, their true legacy began only after the world believed them extinct. The Mongols had shattered their fortresses, burned their libraries, and scattered their people. But they could not extinguish the idea that Hassan-i Sabbah had forged atop that lonely mountain centuries earlier. Ideas once born do not die with walls. They slip beneath the soil, sometimes resting, sometimes waiting, sometimes rising again in forms the world does not immediately recognize. The surviving assassins, the Nizari Ismailis, learned to live in the spaces between empires, adopting disguise not for killing, but for survival. In some regions, they blended into rural communities, farmers tending fields beneath the watch of suspicious rulers. In others, they quietly rose as traders, craftsmen, scholars, and healers. Their enemies still believed the old man of the mountain controlled shadowy killers scattered across the world. But the truth was far more human. The Nizaris were rebuilding, redefining themselves, and becoming a people who carried memory instead of daggers. Yet memory can be powerful, and so the stories of the medieval assassins, half truth, half legend, began their next journey, traveling across centuries like migrating birds, carried by scholars, merchants, explorers, and storytellers. In Europe, chroniclers twisted the legacy of the Nizaris into exotic tales of mysticism and terror. Because Europeans did not understand the political realities of the Middle East, they filled the gaps with imagination. They described the assassins as sorcerers, drugged fanatics, or slaves bound by enchantments. They misunderstood belief for madness, discipline for brainwashing, loyalty for blind devotion. And once that image took root in Western literature, it flourished wildly. Poets, philosophers, and travelers repeated the rumors until they became accepted truths. Marco Polo's account, though historically inaccurate, became the seed from which modern myths grew. His fantasy of lush gardens, intoxicating pleasures, and hypnotized killers captivated readers. The tale of a secret paradise used to manipulate young men into dying for their master fascinated audiences so deeply that they never questioned its absurdity. And thus the legend grew, a legend that overshadowed the real history of a community shaped not by hallucinations, but by conviction and persecution. Over time, the word assassin entered European languages, stripped from its origins, transformed into a universal term for a killer in the shadows. Its haunting power came not from what the Nizaris truly were, but from what the world imagined them to be. But while myths captured Western fascination, the living descendants of the assassins continued their quiet evolution. Their leadership, the hereditary line of imams, guided them through eras of turmoil. They moved from Persia to India, from India to East Africa, and eventually into a global diaspora. In each region they adapted, integrating knowledge from new cultures while preserving their own spiritual identity. They built schools, hospitals, trade networks, and communities defined not by fear, but by resilience and learning. The transformation was so complete that by the modern era, the Nizari Ismailis had become known not for violence, but for education, philanthropy, and cultural preservation. Their contemporary spiritual leader, the Aga Khan, became one of the world's most influential figures in humanitarian work, a far cry from the medieval image of cloaked assassins. Yet the past never truly disappears. The memory of Alamut, Its defiance, its brilliance, its tragedy, remained engraved in the cultural consciousness of the Nizari people, passed down in oral traditions, poetry, and secret histories. And as global interest in ancient mysteries rose in the 19th and 20th centuries, Western historians began to revisit the story of the assassins. This time, instead of repeating medieval exaggerations, scholars dug deeper, uncovering manuscripts, chronicles, and surviving Nizari texts. A new picture emerged, not of mad killers, but of a persecuted minority who created an extraordinary system of survival in a hostile world. Alamut transformed from a symbol of terror into a symbol of defiant independence, intellectual ambition, and the willingness to resist oppressive empires. It became the subject of novels, academic studies, political analysis, and eventually, the fuel for one of the most successful entertainment franchises of the modern age. When the 21st century arrived, millions of people around the world encountered the word assassin, not in academic texts, but in digital landscapes and epic storytelling. Video games, films, and novels reinvented the brotherhood as a symbol of freedom, rebellion, and resistance against tyranny. Though fictionalized, these modern reinterpretations sparked renewed interest in the real assassins, driving new generations to ask, who were they really? Why did they inspire such fear? How did such a small group shape so much history? The truth, long buried under layers of myth, resurfaced. The assassins were not simply killers, they were strategists, visionaries, and survivors who dared challenge empires with ideas instead of armies. Their legacy teaches that the sharpest weapons in history have never been blades or arrows, but belief, discipline, and the courage to strike at injustice, even when the world calls it madness. And so, as the centuries stretch behind us and the ruins of Alamut stand silent beneath the cold winds of Iran's mountains, the spirit of the assassins lingers, in memory, in myth, and in the unstoppable human desire to understand the truth behind the shadows of history, because history is not shaped by those who march in daylight, but by those who dare to move unseen through the darkest corners of their time, leaving footprints that echo long after empires crumble.